our breakfast morning talk is going to begin. It's a bit unfair because you're eating breakfast, I'm talking, but it's okay. It happens. It happens. So it's funny a bit because we are going to talk about a movement which actually was aiming at greater social justice. So we are going to talk about my recent opus dealing with colonial age Korean communism. Well, actually, writing books on colonial age Korean communism is a sort of modern tradition in Korean studies. And this tradition was actually first initiated in the United States in 60s and 70s during the Cold War time. And you perhaps already can guess why Korean communism became so much of interest to Cold War scholars like Robert Scalapino, for example. You can already see what they had in mind. Know the enemy. You have to know your enemy. At that point, the idea was that North Korea is a state which in a way is a historical an outcome of colonial period communist struggle. So to understand North Korea, which was America's enemy and remains to a degree, so you had to understand colonial period Korean communism. So that's how studies on colonial period communism started in Cold War age. South Korea came onto this field a bit later because communist research were tabooed until around sort of early 1970s and then only partly allowed. In South Korea, when research on communist movement were fully allowed in late 1980s, the framing was somewhat different. In Cold War America, it was know your enemy research. In South Korea, however, the people who were doing those research were actually people who were in sympathy with colonial age communist fighters. But to legitimize this sympathy in a deeply anti-communist society wasn't easy. And one way to do so was to frame them as first and foremost independence fighters, Korean nationalists first, communists second. Well, it's not necessarily wrong per se. Actually, they obviously were independence fighters, and in many cases, they were former nationalists, so they espoused a form of leftist nationalism, you can say it. So, but at the same time, they were part of a worldwide movement, which was much bigger than simply Korean anti-colonial nationalism. That's what I am going to emphasize here. So, Cold War American research were mostly about colonial age communism as predecessor of North Korea. I'm less interested in that. I'm more interested in long-term dynamics of social justice struggles on the Korean Peninsula. I'm more interested in South Korea. And I see that if you take a very long-term perspective, obviously this continuous tradition of social justice struggles, it changed South Korea in a way too, and that's one point which I tried hard to emphasize in my book. It's just I wanted to give you a sense of what long-term perspective means. Here, this is Chosun Il-bo from 1927, Communists on Trial. And here is a South Korean newspaper, I can't remember which, from early 1990s, about a socialist Sanomen League distributing its leaflets at a trade union gathering. So you have a historical distance in sort of 65 years, but the same movement with very similar mindset, goals, and so on, obviously managed to somehow continuously influence Korean society. So that's what I was interested in. And if we try to answer the question, okay, but what obviously South Korea is not only non-socialist, it's also pretty ultra-capitalist neoliberal state anyway. So what did this movement gain in the end? If we are looking to South Korea, I would say that it's not necessarily very visible from the first sight, but we gained a lot. lots of people who espoused diverse kinds of Marxist beliefs were, for example, beyond the movement for protecting the weak, protecting the human rights. So it's pretty well known that year 2010 was a bit historical in South Korean history. Since then, so students in the schools are no longer subjected to corporal punishment. Corporal punishment used to be quite severe in South Korea until the beginning of the century, and it was phased out relatively recently, and the person beyond this, the superintendent of education and so, Cho Hee-yeon, is actually a convicted Marxist. So in a way, you had the people who espoused Marxist socialist beliefs who also worked for human rights and actually achieved a lot on this field. And yet another point, 20 years ago, say 20, 25 years ago, there was very little, extremely rudimentary welfare state in South Korea. But 22 years ago, Social Democratic Korean Democratic Labour Party for the first time entered Korean parliament. It was quite a historical thing, actually. So, and it proclaimed a rather radical welfare commitment. So, and the ruling sort of liberal party, center liberal party, had to compete with social democrats, also in the field of welfare. So social democrats were pressing for more welfare expenditures, and ruling liberals, who had somehow to maintain their popularity in the face of social democratic opposition, had also to work for increased welfare expenditures. So the first decade of the century was actually the time in South Korean history when welfare expenditures increased pretty radically. So you obviously had at least some gains, and the biggest one, which obviously now is being jeopardized by the current government, is the development of the idea of peaceful unification. This very term, Pyeonghwa Tongil, peaceful unification, was first suggested by a social democrat, Cho Bo-nam, in the 1950s. Cho Bo-nam was the head of Social Democratic Progress Party, and he got very significant following. In the end, he was framed up as North Korean spy and executed, and his party was forcibly dissolved. But the idea of peaceful unification stayed, and in the end, it was taken over by the mainstream and became more or less official orthodoxy. That's what often happens with good ideas. They begin as heterodoxy. They begin as something dissident and oppositional, and then they are being appropriated by the mainstream. It's exactly a historical trajectory of the idea of peaceful unification today. But as you perhaps have heard, it looks like unification in Korea now is more or less being given up on. So how did it all start? In South Korea, much of research on communist movement, as I have said, concentrated on it being part of Korean nationalist story, Korean nationalist narrative. I'm interested in that, but I'm also interested in global history. I'm trying to frame it as part of global history. The thing is that there is such a thing in capitalist world system as periodic world revolutions. In 1848, then you had another global revolution after the First World War, and you had a global revolutionary wave in 1968. So Korean communist movement was a child of this global revolutionary wave, which came in the wake of the First World War, and it coincided nicely with radicalization inside colonial Korean society. Obviously much first movement, but also if you look into the statistics of the early 1920s, you see upsurge in almost all movements, in peasant movement, workers movement. And it was a part of this radical upsurge that former Christians or former nationalists were increasingly getting converted into something new, namely socialist doctrine. So here in their conversion, one important point which facilitated it was the existence of the worldwide proselytizing movement, which then could take over after they converted the Comintern. Again, in today's historiography, Korean, or I would say even global, Comintern has a pretty bad reputation. It's obvious, it's quite obvious that from late 1920s, it became a tool of Stalinist foreign policy. Its debacle in China was of enormous proportions, and so and so on. But at the same time, Comintern was a bit more than simply a tool of dictatorial foreign policy. The cadres of Comintern were both Soviet and foreign, and many foreigners were professional radicals from a number of countries. So Comintern radicals could contribute their experiences to Korean movement. They could share knowledge. They could also help finances of the Korean movement. They could train Korean militants. Actually, more than 200 Korean militants were trained in Moscow in various Comintern schools. And those people remained active and quite central to Korean history. Chobonam, under the name of Pak Chol-hwan, he was trained in Comintern's Communist University of the Eastern, of the tallest of the East in the years 1923, 1920. Figures also got their training from the same schools. So Comintern's role was in a way both positive and negative in many respects. And well, that's where it used to be. But one important thing we have to remember is that Comintern helped to create Korean Communist Party in 1925. It was in constant communication with it. It was sending it its budget and so on. And we still have to remember that the dependency between Korean communists and Comintern was mutual. None of Comintern's non-Korean cadres could speak Korean. So whatever they knew about situation on the Korean peninsula completely dependent on Korean sources. So it was and victory of Korean Revolution was something very important for Comintern because they correctly understood that in Korea, the probability of a revolutionary upheaval was high, much higher than in Japan. It also meant that lots of resources were being concentrated on Korea. It's interesting that, for example, the number of Korean students at this particular place, Communist University of the tallest of the East, a number of Korean students was 5 times higher than the number of Japanese students. So it was very strong focus on Korea. Comintern needed Korea just as Korean communists needed Comintern. Now, the party was, as an underground party, established in 1925. By 1928, due to police repression, it was basically defunct. And in 1929, Comintern also made it official that the party is defunct. But what is important here is then the struggle continued, and it was continuing often without much assistance from Comintern. In lots of places where those communist struggles in the 1930s were taking place, sometimes Comintern sent militants like Kang Jin, a Soviet Korean who was very active in 1930s underground. Sometimes they were there. But in most cases, there are hundreds of activists who were making some regions, especially in northern Hamgyong, into a sort of liberated zones where red peasant unions were wielding a sort of semi-official power. So hundreds of those activists had little to do with Comintern. It was cells had no relationship with Moscow whatsoever. Typical example would be EJU, almost legendary radical who was leading workers and students movement, underground movement in the 1930s. Li Jieyu was known for the number of cells he found and for his particular leadership style. He didn't want the leadership to become dictatorial, so the leadership worked in troikas, in three persons were assigned to each particular cell so that to lead it collectively. Li Jieyu was completely homegrown communist who had no contact with Moscow whatsoever. So it just shows that we are.
I'm sorry, those who are online, please mute yourselves.
Okay, so so what I just wanted to emphasize here is that Korean radicalism in the colonial age, communist radicalism, was not simply something implanted from Moscow. It had its own indigenous roots. And by the 1930s, it was completely indigenized. Ijeyu studied in Japan at Nihon University. He had access to the basic texts of communism, like Communist Manifesto and so on, in Japanese. He didn't necessarily even need Moscow in that way. So communism came to Korea in late 1910s, beginning of the 1920s, and by 1930s, it was a completely indigenized movement. There were homegrown radicals, but there were, for example, also academic Marxists at Keiji Imperial University. One such academic Marxist, Professor Miyaki Shikanosuke, was actually hiding Li Jieyu in his own professorial residence. It became a case célèbre. So Miyaki Shikanosuke had Korean disciples, homegrown Marxists, so to say, who were studying Marxism theoretically with the use of German originals. So again, in historically extremely compressed time, less than 10 years, Marxism became a part of the indigenous ideological and social landscape. So again, here too, we perhaps encounter what Professor Chang Yong-sop, whose co-authored article we are going to study today in our Korean language discussion group. So Professor Chang Yong-sop came up with his theory on condensed modernity in Korea, Apchukkunde. It's a good example of condensed modernity. You have Marxism and Marxist movement becoming Koreanized in 10 years. It's a very good example that his theory holds water. So, well, Korean communism was in a way perhaps even strongly embedded in the Korean soil than Japanese communism. In Japan, after police rounded up the last communist militants who were still at large in 1941 after Pearl Harbor, there was not much of communist movement in Japan between 1941 and 1945. But in Korea, it continued. In Korea, throughout the whole time of the war, militants from the so-called Kyosan communist group were continuously fighting their occupation, building up the cells, preparing for national insurrection, and trying to get into contact with Mao's forces in Yan'an. By the way, the person whom they sent as the envoy to Yan'an to Mao was one of modern Korea's most brilliant literary scholars and linguists, Kim Tae-jun. He managed to come to Yan'an, but Mao considered him a spy and never talked to him. Anyway, but it's interesting that they were active enough, they were preparing to resist. So then Unfortunately, what happened with Korea is that after the liberation, communist movement there was enmeshed in the geopolitical dynamics. Korea was divided, and in southern part of Korea, anti-communism became foundational for the state identity, for the state building. You might have learned from social theory that often states and societies are built on the exclusion of the other. Or if you read Ilan Papi on Israel and Palestine, you can read a lot about this in Israeli case. So in case of South Korea, it was largely built on the exclusion of anyone who was pronounced red. Exclusion of the Reds, extremely violent exclusion of the Reds, was the very ground, the very foundation of South Korea's identity. And you can say that this identity was also deeply steeped in the history of massacres during the Korean War, where hundreds of thousands of suspected Reds were killed without trial. So in South Korea, the movement was in a way dispatched deep underground for several decades. And in North Korea, it became government. But then this government had to build up a new state following largely Stalinist model and also under the conditions of basically barrack state, since North Korea was now on the forefront of the Cold War. So the whole thing was a disaster for Korean communism, because obviously the degree to which you could realize communist dreams in North Korea was severely limited by both North Korea's relationship to Stalinist model and its geopolitical position. And in South Korea, communism became exactly the inimical other, which was to be rejected as a precondition for your citizenship in South. Was that in North Korea, some in rather strong building of welfare state was coinciding with the process of general state building. So, of course, to a degree, it was something that barrack state needed, because if you have only limited resource of the workers and so on, the state perhaps should take care of their medical services and education, because it is with this workforce and fighting force that your state has to survive in unending war. So in this way, welfare is also related to warfare. But also at the same time, when we look into the speed with which welfare apparatus was built in North Korea, we can also feel some respect to the people who were doing it, also realizing in a way communist dreams from the colonial period about free medicine and free education. By 1960, North Korea was the only third world state which had completely free education, completely free medicine, old age pensions, and in urban zones, even apartments, which were distributed to the workers. So it became a pioneering example of third world welfare. And that, if you look into the development of Cuban medical welfare, for example, North Korea suggested some interesting examples for Cubans. It's not necessarily what many historians ever studied, but in this way, North Korea was a forerunner for the Cuban-style welfare system. So in South Korea, however, the exclusion of the left was continuing, with the leftists framed as spies in the 1950s. And well, the same continued in 60s and 70s. There were underground Marxist circles, and a typical story would be that they were framed as North Korean espionage groups, and their leaders were imprisoned or later executed. And still, the left was also making interesting intellectual gains, because, for example, the first monthly journal in South Korea, which brought up the topic of third world nationalism and third world liberation struggle, was Chonmek, which was run by underground Marxists. So until the 1970s, the main underground Marxist group was the Front of National Liberation of South Korea, Namminjeon. Until the 1970s, the underground Marxists had very little contact with workers' movement. So it was hard to build up the infrastructure of the movement on the factory floor level, since it was completely destroyed before, during, and after the Korean War. Things, however, changed in the 1980s as Korea was industrializing, and the Marxists adopted new strategy of going to the factories and organizing independent unions there and proselytizing among the workers. The same strategy was once adopted in the 1930s. So it's interesting how the same motives are recurring in Korean leftist movements history. So Marxist circles and their work at the factory cells contributed a lot to South Korea's democratization. So, but in the 90s, the first attempts to organize a mass socialist party were a complete disaster. Since, as I have said, grassroots organizations of the left were all destroyed before, during, and after the Korean War. The left had very little to rely upon. However, then, the left was in a way held by its enemies. In 1997, South Korea had to switch to neoliberalism after the Asian financial crisis. It was a huge disaster for South Korean working class, as large part of this working class was relegated to the status of non-permanent workers and remained in the status. You know what is the proportion of non-permanent employees among everyone gainfully employed in South Korea? Happened after the Asian financial crisis. It was a huge blow to Korean working class. And obviously, it was also an opportunity to the left, which used this disaster in order to come up again to the forefront of social movement. Now, organizing the defensive struggles against neoliberalism. By the way, in the beginning of the new century, labor struggle in South Korea, you still have to understand it's very literally. It was really something resembling a battleground, very, very literally. So to say. So on this wave, a social democratic Korean Democratic Labor Party came into parliament. It was formed 24 years ago, came into parliament, and it existed until it split in 2008. And then there happened a very interesting thing. On the one hand, we found out that under the neoliberal conditions, it's extremely hard to build a long-term persistent leftist movement because working class is so atomized and so compartmentalized. Compartmentalized here means that there are no uniform working class any longer. The permanent workers at large enterprises and non-permanent workers in smaller enterprises live in different worlds. Permanent workers at large enterprises live in the first world. Their income levels wouldn't be very different from average EU country. And if you are non-permanent worker at a small enterprise, it's a third world. It's completely different life. So it's very fragmented, compartmentalized working class, which means organizing traditional social democratic party very difficult. But on the other hand, the overexploited segments of the working class, the non-permanent workers, are those who tended to struggle most militantly. And since I know that many of you are interested in South Korean popular culture, have you watched this film? Yes, it deals exactly with the struggles of non-permanent female workers, the most downtrodden part of the South Korean working class. So the left switched now to organizing the downtrodden, to working with non-permanent female young workers, and some gains were also made there. You can see that union rhetoric despite all the troubles you get into if you try to organize independent union in South Korea, it's hard to believe. But in the most neoliberal country on earth, a unionization rate is growing, actually. 10 years ago, it was 9%, one of the lowest in the world, and now it's decent 14%, and it's growing. So lots of, for example, I know that many of you are interested in Korean wave popular culture. You should know also that lots of those enterprises that, for example, produce computer games, they are being unionized right now because the work of the developers there is horrible. It's a really hellish work. So unionization is proceeding there now. So I would say that the history of social justice movement on the Korean Peninsula has very mixed results. Obviously, it never fully triumphed, and you couldn't expect it under the framework of the capitalist vote system. But at the same time, it succeeded in pushing South Korea to having much better welfare system than it used to have. It succeeded at some point in, for example, pushing forward the peace agenda on the Korean. Geopolitical tensions and so on, the struggle is still continuing, so to say. And that's perhaps the most important conclusion. Okay, so I think I'm more or less done, but we are supposed now to have questions and answers. Yes.